Termo to Madeline, Audio Edition, page 199, chapter titled Madeline Meadows, Gateway to the New Agricultural Empire of the West. The Madeline Meadows Land and Irrigation Company came onto the scene in a burst of advertising and promotion that took a back seat to none of the hundreds of irrigations and land development schemes throughout the West. It was advertised in every state of the Union and in some European countries. Advertisements ran in English, Spanish, Italian, French, and German, among other languages. People were brought in to see the project, especially from the farming communities of California and the Midwest. Many of these people felt that the proposition was good and stayed to take up land and farm it. Many others, how many will never be known, felt that the program would fail and refused to become part of it. No small sum of money was spent in making the program workable. By 1909, J. Noble Jones had already spent $400,000 that the original engineer had estimated it would cost to build up the system. The tunnel had been improved and the 26 miles of main canal built. One main ditch had been run down to the Brockmans, and another had gone on around the west side of the 9-mile point. Another 55 miles of lateral ditches would also be built. The company of Sloan and Robinson of San Francisco had been employed to survey and build all the ditches. Everybody at the end of the plains had hired out with their horses to work on the canals. Adolph Arts was the engineer in charge of the construction. He had engineered in China and the Philippines for many years and now had this to say about the Madeline project. It's written, quote, "If a site for any irrigation project may be to order, it could not be better than the land of the Madeline Meadows. There is just the right slope for the gravity system of irrigation, and the land is very rich. The project covers 42,000 acres of the west side of the Madeline Plains and extends 23 miles south of Madeline." Unquote. The system was to constitute 4 reservoirs: Tule Lake Reservoir, the Bailey Reservoir, a dam at what is today called Mitchell Field, which the company called the Sagebrush Canyon Reservoir, and the dike that George Bailey had built south of Termo in 1901. It was planned to take water from all these reservoirs and place it on the land from Termo to Madeline under irrigation. J. Noble Jones had bought Bailey's rights to the dam below Termo. In 1908, he bought an undivided 1/2 interest in the Bailey Reservoir above Madeline from George Bailey. And whether or not Mr. Bailey had that much interest in the reservoir is questionable, but he sold it to Jones anyway. And by December 16th, 1909, J. Noble Jones could say this about his Madeline Meadows project. It's written, quote, "There is this about our system. It's not a project, but an actuality. Our system has been practically fully developed, and we are delivering the water. We have 3 reservoirs complete. Tule Lake is our natural reservoir, and we have 2 other artificial reservoirs. In Tule Lake now, after a season's use of water from it, there are 30,000 acre-feet of water left as a reserve. The total capacity of Tule Lake Reservoir is about 115,000 acre-feet. It is a natural basin and is tapped by a tunnel through basaltic rock, 1,700 feet in length, which tunnel was completed during the present year. This tunnel was steel headgates set in cement and anchored in solid rock. Next spring we shall turn water from our reservoirs into 16,000 acres of land. Our total canal and ditch system is outlined with a cover of 50,000 acres. One of our artificial reservoirs, known as Termo Reservoir, has a dam of 5.5 miles long. The surface back of it is not covered deeply, but though the large area and enormous capacity is obtained. The Madeline Meadows Company is a closed corporation, and we therefore have no stock for sale. Our work is practically finished. During the past 6 months, we have closed over $250,000 worth of water contracts. Within the past week or 10 days, men have come to investigate the ground from Washington, California, Idaho, Montana, and Iowa, all of them practical farmers of long experience. The men who arrived this afternoon in Reno from Iowa and will go out on the NCO in the morning to take land are all representatives of Iowa farmers and men of experience." Unquote. And one of the major promotion areas of the system was located in Iowa. The Hawkeye Real Estate Investment Company of Des Moines had contracted with Mr. Jones to handle the advertising in the Midwest. The Des Moines office advertised, quote, "products of exhibition," which amounted to potatoes, wheat, and apples produced in Madeline. Unquote. Other real estate companies that were doing the advertising in California were the Noble Jones Company of San Francisco and Edwards, Brewster and Clover, also of San Francisco. Everywhere the land and a perpetual water right were being advertised for $31.50 an acre, with 10 years to pay. That was if the desert homestead was taken up. If a person bought land from the company, the package cost him $40 an acre. Over the next few years, the price would go up on the government land to $40 an acre, and deeded land with a water right would cost $50. The company had thousands of acres of deeded land that it had acquired from the Tule Lake Land and Irrigation Company, private individuals, and the U.S. government. During those years between 1905 and 1910, there were similar irrigation and land investment schemes being promoted all over the West. In the most immediate local vicinity alone, there were 3 projects under construction. The Eagle Lake Tunnel was being drilled to carry water to the Honey Lake Valley. At Red Rock, the Madeline Valley Land and Irrigation Company and the Western Land and Power Company were promoting that side of the Madeline Plains on both less water and less capital than J. Noble Jones had in scheme. The Red Rock venture failed first, and Jones became the receiver of the system. But before that time, it was necessary for the prospective landholder to know how to get to the project he was interested in from such far-away places as Southern California or the Midwest. The railroads were more than anxious to provide advertisement for the irrigation companies and at the same time promote business on the line. A typical railroad advertisement can be seen in the Western Pacific publicity notice that ran in large print, covering a full page, in newspapers all over the western states, and it read, quote, "The quickest way to Madeline Meadows from the east or west several hours' ride is saved by traveling the fertile district via the Western Pacific. Direct connection to Doyle may be made which eliminate many miles and hours of desert scenery. This can be done by no other than the productive plateau of Lassen County." Unquote. Now, in 1910, the NCO distributed thousands of copies of this booklet throughout the Southeast and Midwest, describing the beautiful country between Reno, Nevada, and Lake County, Oregon. Much attention was given into farming, crop data, and yields per acre. The NCO Land Commissioner and Irrigation Agent's office in Reno received as many as 50 inquiries a day about the area for several months afterwards. Out of all these supposedly beautiful farming and irrigation districts, Madeline Meadows was right on the NCO's railroad. Furthermore, a line had been surveyed by the Oregon Shoreline, which was to run down from Klamath Falls, Oregon, into Madeline, then out across the west side of the plains to Dry Valley Gap. From there it was to proceed on down to the Sacramento Valley ending in Vina. Because of Madeline's position in the center of the irrigation scheme and its location on these two railways, only one of which ever existed, the Madeline Meadows Project, was advertised as the, quote, gateway to the new agricultural empire of the West, unquote. Madeline Meadows, it was said, was destined to become one of the state's greatest agricultural sections, unquote. Now, concerning the water to be provided by the company, it was said, as it's written, quote, according to 3 irrigation engineers, there is twice as much water as will be needed. Engineers' reports show more water than will be ever used. The supply of water is far in excess of either present or future irrigation needs, unquote. It goes on to say, quote, do you know what work we'll have accomplished and how much money we have spent to bring water to the door of every settler in the Madeline Meadows, to lay out roads to give every buyer modern conveniences? Our free book tells all about it. Tule Lake is the natural reservoir, 6.5 miles long, 27 feet deep, and has a capacity of 90,000 acre-feet of water. Madeline Plains has the best drinking water, purest of any farming community, unquote. Now, about the land that settlers could take up and irrigate with Madeline Meadows water, the following is representative. It's written, quote, it is some of the finest land in the United States. It is ideal soft, free from alkali and hard pan. Soil is unexpectedly fertile. Madeline Meadows has the best soil and climate conditions for sugar beets that can be obtained. Soil analysis by the University of California and Nevada agriculture experts proves the soil does not contain a trace of alkali and is the richest soil in the entire state, unquote. And, of course, to add to the soil water conditions, the climate of the Madeline Plains was advertised as ideal when it was written, quote, Madeline Meadows has a good climate, temperatures as low as 0 and as high as 105. It has had 18 inches of snow, but these are the extremes. 50 days more sunshine than Los Angeles. Very seldom, if ever, are there dust storms, no hailstorms. And the local people want to talk about extremes, not averages. Delightful climate, not severe winters. Free from fog, blizzards, clones, and unseasonable frost. Madeline Valley has all the climate advantages of eastern Washington and somewhat better soil. Madeline Meadows basks in the favor of the sum of 300 days in the average year. Snow falls during the winter months, but doesn't lie on the ground any length of time, unquote. Now, the advertisements ran along this vein until the severe winter of 1911-1912 hit, with its heavy, deep snows, and after that, statements about the climate were modified somewhat, as exemplified by this ad in March of 1912. The issue of the Sunset magazine reads, quote, snow falls during the winter months, but with the exception of 1894 and 1911, it has never been on the ground many days at a time. Frost leaves early in the spring, and the growing season is a long one, unquote. Now, the advertisements told of the hay and grain that could be raised reads, quote, alfalfa seed 5 to 12 bushels per acre, alfalfa hay 2 to 3 sure crops, 1.5 to 3 tons per acre per crop, wheat 40 to 60 bushels per acre, barley 60 bushels per acre, and oats are 80 bushels per acre. Then you got rye 40 bushels per acre. You got Timothy hay, which is 1.5 to 3 tons per acre. Madeline Meadows raised the best alfalfa on the market. For feeding purposes, 1 ton is worth 2 tons of Sacramento Valley hay, unquote. And for the vegetables, they got, quote, potatoes, 100 to 200 sacks per acre. Rhubarb, we got 6 tons an acre. Cucumbers, we got 6 tons an acre. Peas, you can get 3 tons per acre. Onions, they're a profitable crop. And then you got cabbages, carrots, turnips, and celery. They're profitable. Sugar beets. We hope the time is not far distant when a sugar beet factory will be established at Madeline. And of course, fruits and berries. Apples, pears, plums, currants, they're profitable. Strawberries, gooseberries, loganberries, raspberries, and blackberries. One of the most favored spots in the West for producing berries. A number of young fruit orchards are to be found in the local, such trees as apples, pears, plums, and berries being very healthy and thrifty condition. Winter apples, a proven success. All hardy fruits thrive." Unquote. Now, all of the crops that could be allegedly raised are summed up nicely in this ad from October of 1911 in the issue of the San Francisco Examiner. It reads, quote, "The Madeline meadows in Lassen County are the kind of farms that will produce anything from sugar beets to hard wheat, from strawberries to fancy apples." Unquote. Now, of course, the livestock business was also promoted as a big money maker. It's written, quote, "Hog raisers promise to be one of the most profitable industries. The hills surrounding the valley provide splendid feed for stocks during the 8 months of the year. The absence of severe winter weather, the temperature, summer days, the abundance of good water, and the right pasturage make Madeline Meadows one of the best places in California for stock raising. Many of the old settlers have grown rich at it. Several farmers have left the locality after accumulating a huge fortune in the last few years, Mr. Ulty McCabe, now of Berkeley, being one of them." Unquote. Now, beyond all this, it was hoped by the promoters of the system that the west side of the Madeline Plains would become a great honey-producing area. The June 1st issue of the Town and Country Journal of 1910 had the following to say about honeybees at Madeline. "Bee culture. Madeline honey brings premier price. Many varieties of flowers, flowering shrubbery, sagebrush, and alfalfa fields furnish abundant food for bees. Recently, freight teams hauled 23 tons of honey to the railroad station. Madeline honey brings the high price of 25 cents a pound." Unquote. The reader familiar with the Madeline Plains will have quickly recognized that the promotion of the Madeline Meadows Land and Irrigation Company told the good but failed to tell the bad. And yet, at that time, the same as today, if some of the bad was pointed out, those who chose to believe the advertisement at face value assumed that the local people did not want newcomers to settle in the area. Adolph Artz, the head engineer of the company, had the following statement to make on the subject. It's written, quote, "The cattlemen are opposing the settling of the land as much as possible by discouraging settlers with tales of poor crops, but they are not succeeding to any great extent." Unquote. Now, Willis G. Bonin, a salesman for the company, on his first inspection of the system in June 1910, had this to say, quote, "We met a number of persons, some of who were interested in trying to keep the settlers out of the country altogether. We made a great many inquiries among the cowboys and such persons as we had reason to think no personal interest or axe to grind. We learned that when feed was scarce and stocks were starving, that the stockmen were in the habit of driving their herds, in some instances, 100 miles to feed in the Madeline Meadows. A gentleman in Susanville, 60 miles away, who raises fine horses, told us that 2/3 of the year he grazed his horses on the free range in Madeline Meadows. So we were forced to the conclusion that the stockmen were putting up hard but hopeless fight to keep back the advance of the home builders and settlers upon their freedom grounds." Unquote. Now, it would have been for Mr. Bonin's benefit to have listened to the stockmen a little closer. He came to the Plains with a fair-sized bank account, and he left with nothing. The settlers who had been persuaded by him to move there were very unhappy with him at the time, and he, like so many, many others, had learned a hard lesson about the Madeline Plains. So, by way of analysis, who was right and who was wrong? Did Mr. Jones and the Madeline Meadows Company oversell their system? Looking at the situation with hindsight, one would say definitely yes. But at the time, opinion was divided as to whether it was over-promoted or under-promoted. People had lived on the plains for a time, thought that Mr. Jones was exaggerating, but in other areas who were interested in the system thought he was not recommending the area strongly enough. Witness this statement of George E. Steele, a surveyor and civil engineer of Turlock, California, in a letter to J. Noble Jones on July 11, 1910. It's written, quote, "Your statements are not understood, viz. Have 300 days of sunshine. Just below you say, have 100 days of growing weather. Now how can that be? Northern Michigan is lateral 45, has more than that," unquote. Now Mr. Jones answered the inquiry. He says this, quote, "The statement of 100 days of growing weather is perhaps not sufficient, but the idea meant to convey was that you can put in crops in May or June and harvest them the latter part of August or September," unquote. Now George Steele continued to be interested in Madeline, and on June 21, 1910, had the following to say in another letter to Mr. Jones, quote, "I tried here at the Journal office to get a paper from Lassen County, but I could not. Guess that country needs an advertising agent, does it not? Are they really alive up there?" Unquote. Now, people were alive at Madeline, but many of them did not share the faith in the project that J. Noble Jones had. The Bootleg Ranch came under Jones' jurisdiction when he took over the receivership of the Red Rock irrigation scheme. Peter Van Valkenburg strayed on that place as a caretaker and managed in Mr. Jones's employ. He had this to say in a letter to his employer on November 20th, 1912, quote, "This Madeline Meadows is a great country for some future time, when they get down to business and raise clover and cows instead of frozen wheat and small beets," unquote. Now, at any rate, because of J. Noble Jones and the Madeline Meadows Land and Irrigation Company, settlers came in droves. Whether or not all of the things could be done as the company advertised would be seen over the next 10 years. At the end of that time, the settlers would leave as fast as they had come, causing a drop of 80% of the population of the area. Now, for the most part, they left disgruntled, defeated, and broke. Their hopes of owning and operating productive farms had vanished. And whose fault was it? Well, although most of them had never seen, let alone met J. Noble Jones, they blamed him, assuming he had struck it rich at their expense and then left the country before it all collapsed. Crook and swindler, he was called. But that was something the facts did not support. J. Noble Jones might be called naive, financially unwise, or over-enthusiastic, but a crook he was not. Oh, yes, some will say, but he advertised conditions that weren't so. Anybody with the GD brains would have known they couldn't do that. Well, the latter part of that statement, whose author shall remain anonymous, says one thing. The promoters of the system may not have been too smart, but every person who took up land under it would thus have to be described in the same terms. In all fairness, that is not true either. It must be remembered that we, including the author of the above statement, are looking at the Madeline Meadows venture through the benefit of hindsight. Of course, it would not work. That is now a proven fact. But it is this author's opinion that those people, the promoters and the settlers alike, were sincere in their belief that the system was a good one, that it would work. Otherwise, they would not have gambled their life savings and lost everything the way they did. The sad part is that many today still insist on learning this lesson for themselves. Now, concerning the first part of the above statement about the advertising of untrue conditions, let us examine the way the Madeline Meadows Company promoted their system. In order to call it false advertising, one would have to call all real estate promotion false advertising, an idea that this author would not be advised to do. But again, let us try to be fair. Real estate agencies, both past and present, have always advertised by telling certain facts and leaving others out. It is no different with the Madeline Meadows Land and Irrigation Company. What they advertised was fact. What hurt the homesteaders was what had not been told. But here again is all the blame to fall on the promoters. Out of all the people who investigated this system, there were far more who did not take up homesteads, sight unseen, than those who did. They looked into every angle before investing. Of those, however, who subscribed to the system, choosing to believe the advertisement at face value, this system of real estate promotion, as always, was devastating. Certainly apples and plums could be raised at Madeline, and excellent ones at that, but there would only be a crop once every 10 years or so. Yes, the trees were healthy, but that was no indication that the fruit would be produced on them. Of course, grains and hays were produced at Madeline, but again, the superior crops would only come about every 10 years. Certainly the locals wanted to talk about extreme temperatures, not averages. The overall average summer temperatures on the Madeline Plains was not too bad, but it was the extremes. Those killing frosts that would come for a night or two in June, July, or even August, that ruined the crops. The soil was great if one looked in the right places. True, there was a lot of sunshine, but when the temperatures were below freezing, it did no good for the farmer. Now, vegetables could be grown with a high yield per acre in gardens that were lovely cared for. It was a different story on the large acreage farm. There were worlds of free feed in the hills for the livestock, but most of the water was privately owned. And yes, Oldie McCabe got rich at Madeline, but it was because he inherited a bundle from Uncle Matt. The only statements the author has ever been able to find that were totally incorrect about Tule Lake itself and the Oregon Short Line Railroad. The Oregon Short Line was being advertised as an actuality about the time of Madeline Meadows Company went broke, even though it never amounted to anything more than a drawing on paper. And the Tule Lake was advertised as being much larger than it really was. But both of these items had little to do with whether a person could make a living on 160 acres. Why Tule Lake was said to be so much larger than it really was is something that has been very difficult to pin down. The first statements made by the Tule Lake Land and Irrigation Company have it at least twice the size that it possibly could have been in acre feet. Supposedly it covered 3,500 acres that was 6.5 miles long, when in actuality it could have covered no more than 2,500 acres and was never over 3.5 miles long. Was this exaggeration Oltie's or Lynip's idea? Did the original engineer not check up on it? Was it a deliberate exaggeration? And if so, what did it prove in getting people to subscribe to the system? The fact is, if the lake had covered as much territory as advertised and shown on the company maps, there would have been a wall of water over 300 feet in places and 3 miles long, running over the top and into Likely. And the amount of water the lake would hold was exaggerated immensely, the figures always being set anywhere from 80,000 to 120,000 acre feet. If it had been as big as described, it possibly could have held that much, but the determination of capacity was more primitive and difficult in those years and some room made for error has to be granted. Even as late as 1938, a study by the Department of Public Works, Division of Water Resources of the state of California, shows the original lake capable of holding around 35,000 acre-feet of water. Today, with modern sonar equipment, it has been shown that Tule Lake is incapable of holding even 30,000 acre-feet, even though the dam at Cedar Creek has been built to a much greater height than it was in the early days. So, there was enormous exaggeration about the size of Tule Lake. Whether it was deceit, oversight, or poor surveying will be left for the reader to decide, and as the author has been unable to determine the cause. Even in the early days, the capacity of the lake was a controversy, as shown by this statement of W.G. Bohannon on June of 1910. It's written, quote, "We have been told by the irrigation company that Tule Lake covered an area of 3,000 acres. We were also told by the stockmen that one could wade across it. The facts are that it now covers between 4,000 and 5,000 acres and is 27 feet deep in the middle and is capable of holding 6 to 8 feet more water than it now contains," unquote. Now, the statements of both the irrigation company and the stockmen were pretty close to true. But on the other hand, they were both exaggerated, which brings up one last point. Disgruntled settlers tended to exaggerate it also. Again, who is to blame or how it all got started is impossible to nail down. But whence comes the story of the oranges? It has been told in a variety of ways by numerous persons and unfortunately has even crept into print. Supposedly, Madeline grown oranges were, depending on who is telling the story, sold on the NCO, always on display at the Madeline Hotel. They're pictured on postcards growing along a local irrigation ditch or shown in advertisements growing on the sagebrush. The truth of the matter is, if oranges were ever advertised as growing in Madeline, it was some prankster who did it and had nothing to do with J. Noble Jones or the Madeline Meadows Land and Irrigation Company. It is true that apples grown at Madeline were advertised. The year 1909 saw apples grown at the Williams Ranch and at Wilson Bailey's place. Pictures were taken of these apples, and the same pictures were used for several years after that. Probably because there was not another apple crop after that in that length of time. And it is true that locally grown farm products were, at various times, on display at the land office in Madeline. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, and other vegetables grown in different people's gardens at Madeline were shown to prospective subscribers. But oranges? Hardly. Now, if a person saw oranges at the Madeline Hotel, where he could look right out of the window at the sagebrush-covered Madeline Plains, and still believe the oranges grew there, he deserved to be taken. This idea of oranges grown at Madeline places the fraudulent nature of the promoters of the system very high indeed. But it places the stupidity of the settlers and homesteaders on the same plane, neither of which the author chooses to believe. Instead, let us examine what the company actually did say and advertise. First, a settlement made by J.B. Noble Jones in a letter written to a prospective subscriber in July of 1910, who had questioned him about the subject. It's written, quote, "Most hardy fruits will grow there. Citrus or tropical fruits will not. But apples, plums, and berries grown at Madeline Meadows are some of the finest," unquote. Now, W.G. Bonham, of all the salesmen and promoters hired by the company over the years, tended to be the most flowery and exaggerated in his glowing descriptions of the area and its capabilities. He had this to say, quote, "Madeline Meadows will produce almost anything outside of a tropical vegetation," unquote. Now, it is hard to look at the Madeline Meadows Land and Irrigation Company objectively, since so many people lost so much because of it. Emotions enter into every conversation about it. Unhappy settlers needing to blame someone, those who knew J. Noble Jones defending his honesty, those who lived on the Madeline Plains decrying the absurdity of the whole experiment, others staunch in the determination that somebody had to have purposely cheated somebody somewhere, and that somebody had to have been a fool. But who was it? Was it J. Noble Jones? Was it Ulty McCabe or B.F. Lineup? Was it John Williams who made the first survey and determined that there was plenty of water, maintaining that opinion at least as late as 1930? Was it Elmer Van Loan who, along with others, started a sugar beet corporation for mass production of the same at Madeline? Really, it was none of them. All of those actions were a manifestation of times. Now, the United States government was promoting and taking up government lands elsewhere in the West. People were overly anxious to own a piece of land of their own. Real estate promoters, railroads, and businesses of all types stood in opposition to make financial killings through his colonization of the untired and unproven lands of the irrigation ventures. It was a colossal experiment in which everybody got caught up in the spirit of things. And in the end it failed. It failed to one degree or another on all the western high deserts. Madeline Meadows was only a minuscule corner of the entire scheme of things. So, who's to blame? If the failure of the system is anybody's fault, it must be Uncle Sam's, for ever telling anybody they could make a living from 160 to 320 acres of desert land in the first place. Next chapter, titled Land Agents and Promotion Managers, page 225.